She was forcibly taken from everything she loved, but she made the man who hurt her kneel. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing. In the heart of London, where skyscrapers hide more secrets than the shadows they cast on narrow streets, and where money speaks louder than justice, Helen Morrison's fate was sealed on an April night. Daughter of a small merchant from Shoreditch, she grew up amidst imported fabrics and modest dreams, believing that honesty was the only capital needed for a dignified life. Her father, Arthur, had maintained a small shop for decades that, despite difficulties, had always managed to withstand the economic crises plaguing the United Kingdom. But the country had changed, and with it, the rules of the game. The influx of Chinese products at unbeatable prices, market digitalization, and the unforeseen pandemic created the perfect storm. Desperate to save the family business, Arthur resorted to increasingly risky loans until only one name remained: Thomas Constantine, the man many called the king of the British financial market. Thomas wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of man who made wealth seem organic, almost natural, as if money sought him out by magnetism. Son of a dynasty that began in coffee, grew through mining, and consolidated in the financial market, he was the third generation of a family that didn't know the word no. At 42, he commanded the country's largest private investment conglomerate, with offices occupying 3 entire floors of a mirrored building in Canary Wharf, that avenue Londoners called Our Wall Street. Helen knew little about the world of high finance. At 26, she had just graduated in design from King's College London and dreamed of creating her own sustainable fashion brand. She divided her time between helping her father at the shop and working as a freelancer for small local brands. Her life was modest but full of plans, until, on a rainy Thursday, her father came home with a face paler than she had ever seen before. "He's going to take everything, Helen. Everything we built. The shop, the house." Arthur's voice trembled as he held a contract with the Constantine Group's logo. "The interest, they changed the terms and I didn't realize." Helen spent the night studying the contract. She had worked for a semester as an intern at a law firm and knew enough to understand that this wasn't just a predatory loan, it was a meticulously constructed trap. Her father had inadvertently signed a contract that allowed the creditor to take control not only of the shop, but also the modest apartment where they lived in case of any delay. "We'll find a lawyer," Helen said, determined to fight. But Arthur merely shook his head. "I've already tried. No one will go against the Constantine Group, and even if they did, we can't afford it." It was that same night that Arthur's fragile heart, already compromised by years of poorly controlled hypertension, succumbed to the pressure. The heart attack took him in a matter of minutes, in Helen's arms, before the ambulance could even reach their small apartment in Bethnal Green. The day after the funeral, while the pain was still an open wound, Helen received a visit from a man in an impeccable suit, who introduced himself as Thomas Constantine's personal assistant. "Miss Morrison, we deeply regret your loss," he said, with a formality that barely concealed his indifference. "However, the contract signed by your father remains valid, and payment is overdue." Helen tried to argue, to plead for more time, but her words hit an invisible wall of bureaucracy and power. That's when the man offered what he called an alternative solution. "Mr. Constantine is always seeking new talent for his creative team. He saw your online portfolio and was intrigued. If you accept a position on his personal design team, the debt can be renegotiated on more favorable terms." The proposal seemed absurd. How could Thomas Constantine, a titan of the financial market, know the work of a freshly graduated designer? But the alternative was to lose everything that remained of her father's memory. With a heart heavy with distrust, Helen accepted the offer. 2 days later, she walked through the tempered glass doors of the Constantine Group headquarters. The lobby was a monument to corporate power, with marble imported from Italy and a bronze sculpture representing a bull, a universal symbol of a rising market. A receptionist with a practiced smile led her to the private elevator that went directly to the top floor, Thomas Constantine's personal domain. His office was exactly as Helen imagined. spacious, minimalist with a panoramic view of London that made the city seem like a scale model, something one could control with their fingertips. Carefully aligned books filled a dark wood bookshelf, contemporary art decorated the white walls, and, seated behind a glass and steel desk, was the man who now controlled her destiny. Thomas Constantine had the appearance of someone born to command. Tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled his tailored Italian suit, dark hair with strategically placed greying strands at the temples, and eyes so dark brown they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was a precise combination of strong features, a defined jawline, a straight nose, thick eyebrows, which in another context might seem attractive, but here, in that temple of power, only intensified his aura of unquestionable authority. "Miss Morrison?" He didn't rise to greet her, merely indicated the chair in front of him with an almost imperceptible gesture. "Welcome to the Constantine Group." Helen felt an involuntary shiver. His voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice accustomed to giving orders that were immediately obeyed. She sat, maintaining an upright posture, refusing to show the nervousness that ran through her veins like liquid ice. "I appreciate the opportunity," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I confess I don't quite understand what my role here will be." A slow, calculated smile formed on his lips. "Straight to the point. I like that." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her as if she were a rare piece at an auction, something to be evaluated, priced. "I'm developing a new business arm focused on the sustainable luxury market. Your thesis on circular fashion caught my attention. You will be responsible for the conceptual design of our first collection." The explanation sounded plausible, but Helen couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something unsaid. How did he know about her thesis? Why choose her, a recent graduate with no connections, when he could hire any established designer in the country? "And what about my father's debt?" Thomas made a dismissive gesture, as if swatting an invisible insect. "Consider it frozen while you work for me. At the end of 1 year, if your performance is satisfactory, the debt will be forgiven. If not—" He left the sentence hanging, the unspoken more menacing than any word. Helen nodded, feeling the weight of the trap closing around her. It wasn't an opportunity, it was a sentence. In the following weeks, Helen discovered that her work went far beyond conceptual design. She had become a kind of personal assistant to Thomas, accompanying him to important meetings, business dinners, and social events. He introduced her as our new creative promise. But the look he cast her told a different story, the story of a man accustomed to owning everything he desired. The Constantine Group office was a complex ecosystem where power and submission danced a sinister waltz. Helen observed how executives bowed to Thomas's will, how secretaries trembled when he entered a room, how no one dared to question or contradict him. It was a kingdom where he reigned absolute, and everyone else was merely a subject. In particular, Helen noticed the constant presence of Camilla Vance, marketing director and Thomas's right-hand woman. Tall, elegant, with piercing green eyes and always impeccable blonde hair, Camilla was the kind of woman who intimidated simply by entering a room. Rumors in the corridors whispered about an old affair between her and Thomas, something that had ended badly, but which hadn't prevented them from maintaining an almost symbiotic professional partnership. Camilla didn't hide her disdain for Helen. "Just another one of his discoveries," she once heard her comment to another executive, in a tone that made it clear what she thought of these discoveries. It was on a Friday, after a dinner with foreign investors at an exclusive restaurant in Mayfair, that Thomas finally showed his true intentions. The driver dropped them off at the hotel where the investors were staying, and as the businessmen said their goodbyes in the lobby, Thomas placed his hand on the small of Helen's back, a touch that seemed casual but burned through the thin fabric of her dress. "Join me at the bar. We need to discuss the next event." The hotel bar was an intimate space, with dim lighting and live jazz. They sat in a secluded corner, and Thomas ordered whiskey for both of them, without consulting Helen's preference. "You've been doing well," he said, after a long silence. "Better than I expected, actually." Helen took a sip of the drink, feeling the amber liquid burn her throat. "I'm just doing my job," Thomas chuckled, a humorless sound. No, you're doing much more. You're observing, learning, adapting. I see how your eyes register everything, how you analyze every person in the room. It's fascinating. He leaned forward, invading her personal space, and Helen smelled his scent, sandalwood, musk, and something indefinable, something that spoke of old money and newly acquired power. Do you know why I really hired you, Helen? She held his gaze firmly, refusing to back down. I have an idea. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who also had that fire in her eyes, that silent determination. Thomas took another sip of whiskey. Someone who hurt me very badly. The implications of those words hung in the air between them, thick as smoke. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Helen said, feeling her pulse quicken. I just want to fulfill our agreement and move on with my life. Thomas smiled again, that smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's exactly what she would say. He extended his hand, lightly touching Helen's face. Shall we find out if you're also a liar like her? Helen felt nausea rise in her throat. That touch, seemingly light, carried the weight of a veiled threat. She pulled away, trying to maintain her composure. Mr. Constantine, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Thomas, he corrected. And there's no misunderstanding at all. You know exactly what I'm proposing. In that moment, Helen fully understood what it meant to be at the mercy of a man like Thomas Constantine. It wasn't just about money or corporate power. It was about domination in its most primitive sense. He wanted her not because he desired her, but because she represented something to be conquered, subjugated, possessed. I need to leave, she said, standing up. It's late. Thomas didn't try to stop her, merely watched her with that assessing gaze as if anticipating the next moves in a chess game. I'll ask the driver to take you home. But think about what we discussed. Your future and your father's legacy depend on your choices. That night, as the silent driver drove her through the illuminated streets of London, Helen felt something break inside her. It wasn't her spirit or her determination. It was the last barrier of naivety, the last belief that the world could be fair. In its place, something new grew, something cold and calculating. If Thomas Constantine wanted a game, she would play, but not by his rules. In the small apartment she fought to keep, Helen spent the early hours researching. Using the skills she had developed during digital marketing internships, she scoured every corner of the internet for information about Thomas Constantine. Business magazine reports, old interviews, archived lawsuits, even photographs in social columns. Everything that could reveal more about the man who was now her tormentor. One photo in particular caught her attention. Thomas, about 10 years younger, next to a woman of serene beauty. Unlike the models and socialites he was usually photographed with, this woman had an intense, almost defiant gaze. The caption identified her as Louisa Preston, architect and the businessman's girlfriend. Helen had never heard of Louisa Preston, but something in that gaze, that posture, resonated deeply. Could this be the woman Thomas had mentioned, the one who had hurt him badly? Continuing to research Louisa Preston proved surprisingly difficult. It was as if the woman had vanished from the internet after her relationship with Thomas. Only a few mentions on architecture websites, old projects, and then nothing. A digital void that seemed too deliberate to be a coincidence. As the sun began to rise, painting the London sky with shades of pink and orange, Helen had made her decision. She wouldn't just be another victim of Thomas Constantine. She would be his biggest mistake. But to do that, she would need to play a dangerous game, a game where appearances would be her main weapon. Arriving at the office the following Monday, Helen adopted a new demeanor. Not open rebellion, which would surely lead to her ruin, but calculated submission. She began to dress in more sober colors, to speak in a softer tone, to lower her eyes slightly when Thomas entered the room. Small changes that in his eyes would seem like signs of acceptance of her place in that perverse hierarchy. I've thought about our conversation, she said when they finally met alone in the elevator. And you're right. My future depends on my choices. Thomas studied her with those dark eyes, searching for signs of falsehood, of resistance. Helen kept her gaze lowered, vulnerable, letting him see only what he wanted to see. "Dinner tonight," he finally said. "At my apartment. I'll send you the address." Helen nodded, allowing a small smile to appear at the corner of her lips. "As you wish." Thomas's apartment occupied the top 2 floors of an exclusive building in Knightsbridge. It was exactly as Helen imagined, a monument to masculinity and power, with exposed concrete walls, designer furniture, and an impressive collection of contemporary art. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, London stretched out like a carpet of lights at her feet. Thomas received her wearing dark trousers and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, revealing strong forearms and a watch that probably cost more than a luxury car. His hair was slightly damp, as if he had just showered, and the scent of his cologne seemed more intense in the intimate setting of the apartment. "Welcome," he said, leading her through the living room to the balcony, where a table was set for 2 with champagne in an ice bucket and candles illuminating the scene with a golden flickering light. "I hope you like Italian food. My chef has prepared something special." Helen smiled, accepting the glass of champagne he offered. "It's perfect." During dinner, Thomas spoke about himself, his projects, his achievements. Helen listened attentively, asking questions at the right moments, laughing at the anecdotes he told about powerful celebrities and politicians. It was as if she were facing a wild beast. Any sudden movement could awaken its predatory instinct. "You're a good listener," he commented, as they savored dessert, an elaborate creation of chocolate and red berries. "Most people just wait for their turn to speak." "I like to understand people," Helen replied, letting her fingers lightly touch his across the table. "Especially those who intrigue me." Thomas smiled, capturing her hand in his. "And do I intrigue you, Helen?" "Very much so." Her tone was low, almost a whisper. "A man with so much power, so much influence, it must be lonely at the top." Something passed through his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability quickly suppressed. "You have no idea." When he kissed her moments later, Helen allowed herself to respond, even as her stomach churned in repulsion. His kiss was like everything else in his life, controlled, dominant, demanding. He pulled her against him with a force that bordered on violence, his hands exploring her body with the familiarity of someone accustomed to taking what they desired. Helen gently pulled away, breathless. "Not here," she said, touching his face. "Not like this." Thomas frowned, unaccustomed to any form of refusal. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not just another quick conquest." She smiled, a calculated smile designed to appear both shy and provocative. "If we're going to do this, I want it to be special. For both of us." It was a risk she knew. Thomas could easily lose his patience, remind her of her precarious position, force her to yield. But something in his gaze changed, a spark of genuine interest, perhaps. The challenge of conquering, not just possessing. "You're full of surprises, Helen Morrison," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "All right, we'll do it your way for now." When the driver dropped her off at home that night, Helen stepped into the shower and scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to erase any trace of Thomas's touch. But even as her body rejected the physical contact, her mind was clear, cold, calculating. The game had begun, and she was determined not to be just another piece on Thomas Constantine's board. She would be the player who turned the tables. In the following weeks, Helen executed her plan with a surgeon's precision. Every move was calculated, every word measured. During the day, she was the exemplary employee, attentive, efficient, discreet. She began to make herself indispensable not only to Thomas, but to the entire executive team. Her suggestions for the sustainable fashion line were brilliant, innovative, and quickly caught the board's attention. Camilla Vance watched this ascent with growing suspicion. One afternoon, she approached Helen in the executive floor's women's restroom, a space of marble and gilded mirrors where important conversations truly happened. "You're good, Morrison. Better than the others," Camilla said, touching up her red lipstick as she watched Helen in the mirror. But don't delude yourself. I've seen this movie before. Helen maintained a neutral expression as she washed her hands. I don't know what you're talking about. Camilla laughed, a sound sharp as broken glass. Thomas has a pattern. He finds talented, vulnerable girls with something to prove. He brings them close, seduces them, uses them professionally, and then, she made a dismissive gesture, discards them, like that architect years ago, like all the others. Helen felt her heart quicken at the mention of the architect. Which architect? Louisa something. She had real potential, unlike most, but she made the classic mistake. Camilla put her lipstick back in her designer bag. She believed she was special. Before Helen could ask more. The restroom door opened and the conversation died instantly, but the seed had been planted. Helen now knew there was more to Louisa Preston than a simple mention in an old photo. That same night, Helen used her new access to the Constantine Group's internal system to search for any record of Louisa Preston. After hours of sifting through files, she found a protected folder in Human Resources records. Preston Case, Confidential. The documents revealed a sinister story. Louisa had been hired by the Constantine Group as chief architect for a major urban revitalization project. Her work was revolutionary, combining sustainability with the cultural preservation of traditional communities. She and Thomas began a relationship, but when Louisa discovered that the project would be used for gentrification and the displacement of these same communities, she publicly confronted him during a presentation to investors. The retaliation was brutal. Thomas used his influence to destroy her career, blacklisting her from all major architectural firms, spreading rumors about mental instability and erratic behavior. The last document was a non-disclosure agreement signed by Louisa, which permanently silenced her in exchange for a considerable sum. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just about power or control. Thomas Constantine was capable of destroying lives out of revenge, out of wounded pride. And now, she was in the eye of that hurricane. But where others would only see danger, Helen saw opportunity. Every piece of information was a potential weapon. Every detail about Thomas, every weakness, every hushed scandal, every shady deal, all of it could be used against him at the right moment. At night, when she wasn't with Thomas, Helen continued her meticulous research. She discovered patterns in his business dealings, identified questionable partners, mapped the network of influences and favors that sustained his empire. She created a secret file, protected by passwords and stored on secure servers, far from the watchful eyes of the Constantine Group's IT team. During the day, she continued the game of calculated seduction. She allowed Thomas to believe he was gradually winning her over, that her initial resistance was yielding to his charm. Meetings at his apartment became more frequent, more intimate, but Helen always found subtle ways to postpone the final moment of surrender. Sometimes it was unfinished work, sometimes a sudden illness, sometimes the need to do things properly. "You're driving me crazy," Thomas confessed one night, after a dinner where wine flowed freely and his hands had explored much of her body. They were on the apartment balcony, the city pulsating below them like a living creature. "I've never desired anyone like this." Helen smiled, allowing herself to appear vulnerable, touched. "I'm afraid," she whispered, a confession that sounded true because, in a way, it was. "Afraid of what I feel for you, of the power you have over me." Thomas pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair. "I won't hurt you, Helen. Not you." The irony of that promise almost made her laugh, but Helen merely nodded, letting him see tears, real but not for the reasons he imagined, glistening in her eyes. "I need to go," she said, gently pulling away. "Tomorrow we have that meeting with the foreign investors." Thomas sighed, frustrated but resigned. "You're the only woman who's ever made me wait like this." "And is it worth the wait?" Helen asked, with a provocative smile. The look he gave her was laden with desire, and something more, something that, in another man, another context, might be mistaken for real affection. "More than you imagine." The next morning, Helen arrived at the office earlier than usual. She needed to prepare for the meeting, but also wanted time to execute the next phase of her plan. Using the privileged access she now had as Thomas's personal assistant, she made a small alteration to the presentation that would be shown to investors. Nothing obvious, just a revision in the financial projections of a specific project, subtly reducing the estimated return. The meeting proceeded normally until they reached that specific slide. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed Norwegian, immediately questioned the discrepancy between the numbers presented and what they had discussed in previous emails. Thomas hesitated for a moment, confused. He looked at Helen, who maintained an expression of innocent concern, and then at Camilla, who frowned, clearly not having noticed the alteration. "There must be an error in the presentation," Thomas said, maintaining his composure. "We'll clarify this immediately." The meeting continued, but the damage was done. A small seed of doubt had been planted, not enough to ruin the deal, but enough to scratch Thomas's reputation for perfection and absolute control. Afterwards, when everyone had left, Thomas called her to his office. His expression was grim, contained, but Helen could feel the rage simmering beneath the surface. "What happened to those numbers?" "I don't understand," Helen replied, the perfect image of genuine confusion. "I used the data you approved yesterday." Thomas studied her for a long moment, searching for signs of deceit. "Someone altered that data, Helen, and only 3 people had access to that presentation before the meeting: myself, you, and Camilla." "Are you suggesting I would deliberately sabotage such an important meeting?" Helen allowed indignation to color her voice. "Why would I do that?" Thomas continued. "To observe her, his dark eyes impenetrable." Finally he sighed. "No, you wouldn't do that. It must have been a technical error or—" He left the sentence hanging, and Helen realized that the seed of distrust now included Camilla. Perfect. In the following weeks, Helen continued her silent campaign. Small errors in important documents, emails that accidentally didn't reach the correct recipients, confidential information that somehow leaked to competitors. Each incident was too small to arouse immediate suspicion, but together they formed a pattern of growing dysfunction that began to affect the Constantine Group's impeccable reputation. At the same time, Helen grew closer to Thomas on a personal level. Finally, after almost 3 months of calculated dance, she allowed the seduction to reach its inevitable climax. The night she finally surrendered to Thomas was carefully staged. She chose a significant date, the anniversary of her father's death, to add a layer of real emotion to what would otherwise be just a performance. Sex with Thomas was exactly as she expected, dominant, focused on his pleasure, an act of possession more than connection. Helen played her role perfectly, moaning at the right moments, whispering the words she knew he wanted to hear, feigning a pleasure she was far from feeling. Afterwards, as he slept beside her, she observed his relaxed face in slumber. Without the mask of constant control, Thomas seemed almost vulnerable, almost human. For a brief moment, Helen wondered if there was anything salvageable in that man, any spark of kindness buried beneath layers of privilege and corrupting power. The moment passed. Helen silently got up, put on the silk robe he had bought for her, and walked to the balcony. London stretched out before her, infinite and indifferent. Somewhere in that sea of lights, her father had died of a broken heart because of this man. Somewhere Louisa Preston had been silenced and discarded like trash. And how many others? How many lives crushed under the wheels of the Constantine Empire? "What are you thinking about?" Thomas's voice startled her. He was standing at the balcony door, naked except for silk pajama bottoms, his chest still marked by the scratches she had left on his back, her only genuine expression of emotion during the act. "How strange life is," she replied without turning around. "A few months ago I was desperate, about to lose everything, and now I'm here." Thomas approached, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his warm body against hers. "You are exactly where you should be." Helen closed her eyes, allowing herself to receive that embrace, not out of desire, but to feed the illusion. "When did you know? You wanted me like this?" Thomas was silent for a moment, his face buried in her hair. "From the very first day. There was something in your eyes. a strength I hadn't seen in a long time. Like Louisa Preston? She felt his body stiffen instantly. His hands, which had been gently caressing her waist, stopped. For a moment, Helen feared she had shown her hand too soon, but it was a calculated risk, a test to see how far she could push. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice now had a dangerous tone. Helen turned to face him, maintaining an innocent, slightly confused expression. "Camilla mentioned something about an architect who worked for you. Said I reminded her of her." Thomas's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. "Camilla talks too much." "It was just a passing comment." Helen touched his face gently. "I didn't think it was important." "It's not." The answer came too quickly, too tense. "Louisa is in the past, a mistake I don't intend to repeat." Helen nodded, as if accepting the explanation, but noticed how he avoided looking directly into her eyes, a rarity for a man who normally maintained intense, dominant eye contact. "Let's go back to bed," he said, pulling her gently. Helen followed him, but the seed had been planted. Now she knew for sure Louisa Preston wasn't just a former employee, an ex-girlfriend. She was an open wound, a weak point in Thomas Constantine's seemingly impenetrable empire. In the easy days that followed, Helen noticed subtle changes in Thomas's behavior. He was more attentive, more possessive, watching her with renewed intensity. At the same time, she perceived a distancing between him and Camilla, cancelled meetings, tense conversations in corridors, cold glances exchanged during presentations. The casual mention of Louisa's name had created a fissure in the trust between them, exactly as Helen had planned. Meanwhile, the relationship between Helen and Thomas seemed to flourish. He showered her with gifts, jewelry, designer clothes, even a new car. He formally introduced her to the board as the new project manager for the sustainable line, ensuring her an officially respectable position within the company. He began to include her in important decisions, valuing her opinion and, more significantly, implementing her suggestions. To the outside world, it was the classic rags-to-riches story, the talented young woman discovered and promoted by a powerful mentor. Only Helen knew that every compliment, every promotion, every public display of confidence was another step towards Thomas's inevitable downfall. At home alone, Helen continued gathering information. She discovered records of suspicious transactions with influential politicians, elaborate tax evasion schemes, and, most alarmingly, a pattern of buying and destroying small businesses that refused to sell to the Constantine Group. Her father's shop had not been an isolated case. It was part of a larger urban renewal project that was displacing traditional merchants from valuable areas of the city. The predatory loan, the impossible conditions, the legal harassment, all were part of a well-rehearsed strategy. Each discovery fueled Helen's determination. Every piece of evidence was carefully documented, every connection mapped. Her secret file grew day by day, becoming a ticking time bomb waiting to be detonated. 5 months after her first day at the Constantine Group, Helen finally saw her chance to move to the next phase of the plan. The group was about to announce a major urban revitalization project, ironically in the same area where her father's old shop used to be. A mixed-use development that promised to transform the neighborhood while preserving its historical character. Euphemisms for aggressive gentrification. During a preparatory meeting for the announcement, Helen made a seemingly innocent suggestion. "What if we invited some of the old merchants from the area to the launch event? It would be a gesture of goodwill, showing that we value the neighborhood's history." Camilla immediately opposed the idea. "We don't need disgruntled people ruining our event. Most of them still blame us for losing their businesses." "Precisely because of that," Helen replied, keeping her voice calm and reasonable. "It's an opportunity to change that narrative, to show that the Constantine Group isn't the villain they think we are. We can offer symbolic compensation, perhaps even subsidized rental spaces in the new development for some of them." Thomas, who had been observing the debate in silence, suddenly nodded. "Helen is right, it's a smart public relations move. Besides, it protects us from potential protests." Camilla shot Helen a cold look but didn't dispute it further. The meeting continued, but Helen knew she had achieved what she wanted, an opening. That night in her apartment, not the small place in Bethnal Green, but a new, luxurious apartment in Notting Hill that Thomas had helped finance. Helen began the next phase. Using a list of former merchants from the area, she began making calls. "Good evening. My name is Helen Morrison. I work for the Constantine Group." Most hung up immediately. Some shouted obscenities before cutting the call. Helen persisted until she finally found someone willing to listen. Mrs. Eleanor, a 70-year-old woman who had lost the stationery shop she had run for 3 decades. "I'm only listening because I knew your father," Mrs. Eleanor said, her tired voice conveying years of lost battles. "Arthur was a good man. We were all devastated when we heard—" "That's why I'm calling," Helen interrupted, feeling genuine emotion mix with her calculated performance. "I'm trying to change things from the inside, Mrs. Eleanor, and I need your help." Slowly, night after night, Helen built a network of unlikely allies, former merchants, investigative journalists interested in corporate corruption, housing rights activists, and even a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. All connected by a common goal: to expose the Constantine Group's predatory practices. At the same time, Helen began discreetly leaking internal documents to this network. Nothing that could be traced directly back to her, nothing that would immediately compromise the group, but enough to build a solid case, piece by piece. During the day, she continued to be the exemplary employee, the devoted girlfriend. Thomas became increasingly emotionally involved, even casually mentioning long-term plans, trips they would take together, and even a possible promotion that would officially place her on the executive board. "You've changed my life," he confessed one night, as they dined at an exclusive restaurant overlooking Hyde Park. It was a rare moment of genuine vulnerability. "Before you, I was empty, just accumulating more power, more money, without really feeling anything." Helen observed him with genuine fascination. It was like watching a predator believe it had transformed into a domestic animal. "We can all change, Thomas. Even someone like me." There was a disturbing sincerity in his voice. For a moment, just a moment, Helen hesitated. Was it possible that Thomas was truly changing? That the cold, calculating man was developing something akin to conscience or remorse? Then she remembered her father, dying in her arms. Louisa Preston, silenced and destroyed. Mrs. Eleanor, and dozens of others, driven from their lives by pure corporate greed. "We can all change," she repeated, reaching out to touch his hand. "But some things cannot be undone." The launch event for the revitalization project was scheduled for a sunny spring Friday. The chosen location was symbolic, an old textile factory transformed into an event space in the heart of the area to be revitalized. Important politicians, celebrities, journalists, and, thanks to Helen's insistence, a small group of former merchants, including Mrs. Eleanor, were invited. On the morning of the event, Helen woke up beside Thomas in his luxurious apartment. She watched him sleep for a few minutes, studying the lines of his face, the first wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, the grey strands that now multiplied in his dark hair. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine an alternative reality where they had met under different circumstances, where he wasn't the man he was, where she wouldn't have to do what she was about to do. The moment passed. Helen silently got up and went to make coffee. Today would be the day everything would begin to crumble for Thomas Constantine. The event began promptly at 10 a.m. Thomas, impeccable in a grey Italian suit, delivered an eloquent speech about inclusive progress and revitalization with social responsibility. Helen, elegant in an emerald green dress, ironically a gift from him, watched from the front row, applauding at appropriate moments, smiling with pride when he mentioned her as the visionary behind our new commitment to sustainability and social responsibility. Everything was going perfectly until the Q&A session. That's when Mrs. Eleanor, leaning on her cane, slowly stood up. "Mr. Constantine," she said, her voice fragile but clear into the microphone offered to her. "You've spoken a lot about social responsibility. Could you explain how that applies to the dozens of small businesses that were forced to close to make way for your project? Businesses like that of the late Arthur Morrison, who died of a heart attack after receiving your eviction notice." A heavy silence fell over the auditorium. Thomas hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. His eyes sought Helen, who maintained an expression of polite surprise, as if she also hadn't expected such a questioning. I deeply regret any difficulties our previous projects may have caused, Thomas finally responded, regaining his composure. That's precisely why our new approach prioritizes the inclusion of existing communities. Inclusion? Mrs. Eleanor's voice now trembled with indignation. Do you call it inclusion when you offer loans with impossible interest rates and then take everything we built? When you use your connections to block our businesses? When... The microphone was gently taken from her by a visibly nervous press officer, but the damage was done. Other hands shot up. Journalists now with sharper, more specific questions. Mr. Constantine, the Times newspaper is investigating allegations that your group used predatory practices to acquire properties in this area. Would you care to comment? There are rumors of a serious fraud office investigation into connections between the Constantine Group and recent city council decisions favoring your projects. Do you confirm or deny? Thomas maintained his outward calm, answering each question with the rehearsed confidence of an experienced executive. But Helen, who knew him intimately now, could see the almost imperceptible signs of growing panic. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers discreetly tapped on the podium, the subtle perspiration at his temple. The event ended abruptly, with the press officer announcing that the time for questions was over. Thomas was quickly escorted off stage, while Camilla tried to contain the journalists with vague promises of future interviews. Backstage, Helen found Thomas in a small waiting room, his face pale, his eyes blazing with fury. "Who organized this?" he demanded as soon as the door closed, leaving them alone. "Who let that old woman in? You were the one who approved." "The guest list," Helen replied calmly. "You said it was a good public relations move, remember?" Thomas ran his hands through his hair, disheveling his perfect coiffure. "This was an ambush. Someone leaked information. Someone is feeding these journalists." His gaze fixed on Helen, suddenly suspicious. "Do you know that woman? She mentioned your father." Helen kept her face impassive, only slightly concerned. "Many people knew my father, Thomas. He had a shop in the area for decades." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning her face for betrayal. Helen held his gaze, allowing genuine concern, not for him but for the success of her plan, to show through. Finally, he sighed, seeming to calm down a little. "I'm sorry. I'm stressed and looking for culprits." He approached, taking her hands in his. "You're the only person I can trust now." "Always," Helen replied, squeezing his hands gently, ignoring the nausea rising in her throat. That night, as Thomas frantically worked with his public relations team to control the damage, Helen sent a package of documents to the investigative journalist who had asked about the serious fraud office. The package included evidence of irregular payments to municipal officials, compromising emails exchanged between Thomas and influential politicians, and details of the scheme used to force merchants like her father to sell their businesses. It was just the beginning. The perfect storm that Helen had meticulously engineered for months was finally forming on the horizon. The next day, when the first story exploded on the front page of the Times, Constantine Empire built on the ruins of small businesses, Thomas was unrecognizable. The confident, controlled man had been replaced by someone agitated, paranoid, casting accusations at everyone around him. "Someone betrayed us," he said, during an emergency meeting with the board of directors. His eyes swept over the face of each executive present, pausing for a moment on Camilla, whose expression remained rigidly professional. "And I will find out who." Helen observed the scene with outward calm, offering silent support, while internally counting the minutes. She knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion turned to her. And that would be the moment of her final strike. The moment Thomas Constantine would discover exactly who had destroyed his empire and why. The following week passed like a slow-motion nightmare for Thomas Constantine. Each day brought a new revelation, a new scandal, another piece of the empire that began to crumble. The share price of the Constantine Group plummeted. Important clients began cancelling contracts. Politicians who once answered his calls at the first ring were now unavailable. The press, which for years had been tamed with generous advertising and privileged access, now pursued him like wolves scenting blood. Helen observed everything with the meticulous attention of a surgeon monitoring vital signs. Every new article, every announced investigation, every broken alliance was the result of her months of silent work. The documents she had strategically leaked to journalists, prosecutors, and activists now emerged as irrefutable proof of corruption, market manipulation, and predatory business practices. In the midst of this chaos, Thomas clung to Helen like a man clinging to a life raft in the middle of the ocean. She was his safe harbor, his confidant, his only ally in a world that seemed to have turned against him. The fact that she remained by his side, seemingly loyal and unwavering, only reinforced his trust in her. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he confessed one night, as they drank wine in the penthouse that now seemed more like a besieged fortress than a symbol of power. His eyes, once so cold and calculating, now revealed a vulnerability Helen had never imagined seeing. "Everyone else is jumping ship." Helen covered his hand with hers, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and something she refused to acknowledge as pity. "I'm here. We'll get through this together." The lie left her lips with frightening ease, but something new was disturbing her resolve. The growing realization that Thomas genuinely believed her words, that his feeling, however improbable it seemed, was real. This realization was confirmed the next morning when she found a small velvet box beside her plate at breakfast. Thomas watched her with an almost painful intensity as she opened the box, revealing a diamond ring that had certainly cost a fortune. "Marry me," he said without preamble, without rehearsed romance. It was almost an order, almost a plea. "When all this is over, when we clear my name, I want to start anew. With you." Helen felt the ground open beneath her feet. This was not a development she had foreseen in her meticulous plan. The ring sparkled in the box, accusatory, disturbing. In another life, in another scenario, perhaps it would be a symbol of love. Here, in that moment, it was a dangerous complication. "Thomas, Helen hesitated, genuinely speechless for the first time in months. "This is—" "You don't have to answer now," he interrupted, closing the box and sliding it closer to her. "Just think about it. Please." There was a plea in his voice that made something twist in Helen's chest. It wasn't exactly remorse, she was far beyond that, but the uncomfortable understanding that even monsters could love in their own distorted way. This was not the time for hesitation, however. The plan was in its final phase, and any weakness now could compromise everything. Helen put the box in her purse, promising to think about it, knowing there would never be a real answer to that proposal. That same afternoon, while Thomas was in an emergency meeting with the board of directors, Helen executed the most audacious part of her plan. Using the privileged access he had granted her to the company's systems, she transferred a massive amount of confidential documents to external servers, emails, memos, contracts, all meticulously selected to build an irrefutable case not only of unethical business practices, but of concrete financial crimes. Then she made a call she had been postponing for weeks, to a number she had obtained after an exhaustive search, a number that shouldn't exist anymore. "Hello?" The female voice on the other end sounded cautious, defensive. "Louisa Preston. My name is Helen Morrison. We need to talk about Thomas Constantine." A heavy silence followed the mention of that name. "I don't know who you are, but I have nothing to say about that matter." The voice was now cold, distant. "He destroyed my life, too," Helen said quickly, sensing the other woman was about to hang up. "And now I'm about to destroy his. I thought you'd want to know." Another silence, longer this time. Helen could almost feel the internal battle happening on the other end of the line, curiosity versus self-preservation, a desire for justice versus the fear of reopening old wounds. "How did you get my number?" Louisa finally asked, her voice now controlled but no longer distant. The same way I got all the documents that are destroying his empire right now, by being patient and meticulous. Helen paused. I know what he did to you. I saw the records. I read the reports. It wasn't fair. A deep sigh from the other end. Nothing he does is fair, Helen. That's why I'm living in another country, using another name, trying to rebuild a career he crushed out of pure ego. That's why I'm calling, Helen continued, feeling adrenaline surge through her veins. Tomorrow, the Serious Fraud Office will receive a complete set of evidence regarding his activities, including how he manipulated your case. You could be a crucial witness. Are you asking me to come back to face him publicly? Louisa's voice now trembled slightly. You don't understand what he's capable of. I understand perfectly, Helen replied, feeling the weight of the velvet box in her purse. I've been living with the monster for months, pretending to love him just to get to this moment. Silence again. Then, surprisingly, a small laugh. Not of humor, but of recognition. You're exactly as I was, Louisa said, her tone now almost resigned. Before he broke me. I'm not broken, Helen asserted, with a conviction that came from the depths of her soul. And neither are you. He just made us believe we were. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, ending not with a definitive promise from Louisa, but with the opening of a possibility. She would think about it. She would consult her lawyer. She would consider returning. It was enough for now. When Thomas returned from the meeting that night, he was more dejected than ever. The board had voted to temporarily remove him from the presidency while investigations proceeded, an unprecedented humiliation for a man who had founded the company, who had transformed it into a giant. They can't do this, he muttered, repeatedly, as he paced the apartment like a caged animal. Without me, the Constantine Group doesn't exist. Helen watched him from the balcony, where she sat with a glass of wine. Who voted against you? Thomas stopped his agitated pacing, turning to face her. All of them, all the damned ones, including Camilla. He let out a bitter laugh. Corporate loyalty, isn't it? Camilla always had her own ambitions, Helen commented, keeping her tone casual. She must be seeing this as an opportunity. You have no idea. Thomas approached, collapsing into the chair beside her. I just found out she's collaborating with the investigators, offering information in exchange for immunity. Helen feigned surprise, although she knew perfectly well about this fact. After all, it was she who, weeks earlier, had planted the first evidence that would lead investigators to Camilla, knowing that the woman would choose to save her own skin. This is... Helen hesitated, as if searching for the right word. Devastating. It's betrayal, Thomas corrected, his dark eyes now glowing with contained fury. But it doesn't surprise me. Camilla was always calculating, just as Louisa was naive. You're the only one... He stopped himself, reaching out to touch her face. The only one who truly understands me. Helen allowed the touch, leaning her face slightly against his hand, while something heavy and cold settled in her stomach. Thomas genuinely believed what he was saying. Somehow, in his distorted mind, he had rewritten the narrative to see himself as a victim, not a predator. The next morning dawned grey and rainy, as if London knew this would be a day of reckoning. Helen woke before dawn, watching Thomas sleep, a restless slumber, disturbed by nightmares that made him murmur and stir. Silently she got up, dressed, and picked up her purse. Inside, besides the ring she would never formally accept, was a USB drive containing copies of all the evidence she had already distributed to authorities and journalists. Her last act would be to personally deliver this USB drive to the Serious Fraud Office along with her own testimony. She was about to leave when his voice stopped her. Where are you going so early? Thomas was sitting on the bed, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from a man who had barely slept. There was something in his gaze, a nascent suspicion, a slow awakening to a terrible possibility. Helen thought quickly. She could lie, say she was going to buy bread, get medicine, anything trivial, but something inside her was tired of pretending. I'm leaving, Thomas. He blinked, as if he didn't understand the words. Leaving? You mean for the office? No. Helen remained by the door, keeping a safe distance. "I'm leaving you. Leaving all of this." Thomas slowly stood up, as if fearing that sudden movements might scare her away. "If it's about what's happening, we can get through this. We can go abroad for a while, wait for the dust to settle." "That's not why." Helen took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, the weight of months of pretense, of constant calculation, of endless vigilance over every word and gesture. "It's because I always knew who you were, from the very first day." The confusion on Thomas's face slowly gave way to horrified comprehension. "What are you saying?" "My father died because of you, Thomas. It wasn't just any heart attack. It was brought on by the despair you caused, by the trap you set for him, just as you did for so many others." Thomas shook his head, as if he could deny reality by simply refusing to accept it. "You don't know what you're talking about. I never knew your father personally. They were business decisions, nothing personal." "It's always personal for those who lose everything," Helen interrupted, her voice now firm, stripped of any pretense of softness. "It was personal for my father. It was personal for Louisa Preston. It was personal for every small merchant you crushed on your way to building your empire." Upon hearing Louisa's name, something changed in Thomas's gaze, a flicker of comprehension followed by a darkness Helen knew well. "You—" He took a step towards her, his fists clenched. "What did you do?" Helen maintained an upright posture, refusing to show fear. "What you deserved. I exposed who you really are." "It was you?" His voice now trembled with rage. "The articles, the leaked documents, the panicking investors?" "All me," Helen confirmed, allowing herself a small smile of satisfaction. "Every piece carefully positioned to bring down the great Thomas Constantine." He advanced towards her with surprising speed for a man of his size, grabbing her by the arms with enough force to leave marks. "You're going to destroy all of this now. You're going to call those journalists, the Serious Fraud Office, whoever it is, and say you were wrong, that the documents are false." Helen didn't try to pull away. She looked him directly in the eyes, fearless. "The documents aren't false, Thomas. They're your emails, your orders, your decisions. All I did was show the world what you've been doing for years with impunity." "Why?" The question came laden with genuine disbelief, as if he truly couldn't comprehend why someone would betray him so completely. "I gave you everything. Position, money, power. I offered you marriage." Helen laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You really don't understand, do you? It was never about what you could give me. It was about what you took from me, from all of us." For a moment, it seemed he would physically assault her. His dark eyes burned with a primitive fury. His fingers tightened on her arms. Helen braced for the impact, knowing that even that would be part of her victory, further evidence of his true nature. But the blow never came. Instead, something unexpected happened. Thomas abruptly released her, recoiling as if he had been burned. His hands trembled, and on his face was an expression Helen had never expected to see, not just anger or shock, but a deep, visceral pain. "You used me." The words came out almost as a whisper. "All this time, like you used so many others." Helen adjusted her purse on her shoulder, ready to leave. "The difference is that this time, you're on the wrong side of the equation." Thomas collapsed onto the edge of the bed, his body suddenly seeming much smaller, much more fragile. "I loved you," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I truly loved you." Helen hesitated at the door. There was something in his absolute defeat that deeply disturbed her. It wasn't pity, she was beyond that, but a strange sense of emptiness. The revenge she had planned for months was now complete, but the taste was more bitter than sweet. "Goodbye, Thomas. When the investigators arrive, and they will come today, tell the truth. It's the only chance you have to safeguard something of your dignity." She was about to leave when his voice stopped her one last time. "Wait." Thomas looked up, and there was something different there, a clarity that hadn't existed before. "You're right," Helen frowned, suspicious. "About what?" "About everything." He slowly stood, no longer the corporate predator, but a man facing the truth about himself for the first time. I destroyed lives. Your father, Louisa, so many others. I always told myself it was just business, that it was how the world worked. But deep down, I knew. Helen remained motionless, uncertain where that conversation was going, suspicious of some last trick, some final manipulation. "What do you want me to do now?" she finally asked. "Ask? For forgiveness?" "No." Thomas shook his head. "There's no forgiveness for what I did to you, to your father. I'm just asking for time." "Time for what? To run away? To fix what can still be fixed?" Helen let out an incredulous laugh. "You can't fix anything. The damage is done." "Not everything." Thomas walked to his desk, picked up a phone and dialed a number. "Robert, Thomas Constantine, call a press conference for 11 a.m. Yes, today. No prior questions, just organize it." Helen watched, confused. "What are you doing?" Thomas hung up the phone, facing her with surprising determination. "What I should have done a long time ago. Take responsibility." In the following hours, Helen witnessed something she had never imagined possible. Thomas Constantine, the man who had built an empire through manipulation and brute force, now frantically worked to dismantle his own system of protection. He called his lawyer, instructing him to cooperate fully with the investigations. He sent emails to the board of directors, taking personal responsibility for all questioned decisions. He drafted a public statement detailing his unethical practices and acknowledging the damage caused. Helen observed everything with growing perplexity. "Why are you doing this?" Thomas paused for a moment, looking her directly in the eyes. "Because you're right, and because despite everything, what I felt for you was real. Perhaps the only real thing I've ever felt in my life." The press conference was a surreal spectacle. Thomas Constantine, the titan of the British financial market, publicly admitting predatory practices, market manipulation, coercion of small business owners, announcing his resignation from all positions at the Constantine Group, committing to use his personal fortune to create a compensation fund for those who had been harmed. By his side, to everyone's shock, including Helen, who watched from the back row, was Louisa Preston, returned from self-imposed exile. When it was her turn to speak, she spoke not of revenge or justice, but of redemption and reconstruction. "What Thomas Constantine did to me and so many others was unforgivable," she said into the microphone, her voice firm, her clear eyes fixed on the cameras. "But what he is doing today is unprecedented. It doesn't erase the past, but it opens up a possibility for the future." In the days and weeks that followed, the Constantine Empire was indeed dismantled, not by investigators or journalists, but by Thomas himself, meticulously, piece by piece. The group was restructured with new leadership and transparent policies. The compensation fund began contacting former merchants like Mrs. Eleanor, offering not only financial restitution, but real opportunities for a fresh start. Helen followed everything from a distance, having proceeded with her original plan to testify at the Serious Fraud Office. Justice took its course. Thomas faced lawsuits, paid astronomical fines, accepted permanent restrictions on operating in the financial market. But surprisingly, he avoided prison thanks to his extensive cooperation and the reparation program he had created. 6 months later, when the hurricane had largely lost its force, Helen received an unexpected message, an invitation to meet Thomas at a simple cafe in Chinatown, a world away from the luxurious penthouses and exclusive restaurants he used to frequent. She hesitated for a long time before accepting. Part of her insisted there was nothing more to say, that revenge was complete, the chapter closed. But another part, a part she was reluctant to acknowledge, felt curious. She wanted to see for herself if the transformation was real or just another elaborate manipulation. The cafe was an unpretentious place, frequented mainly by students and local workers. When Helen entered, she barely recognized the man sitting in a discreet corner. Thomas wore jeans and a simple shirt, his hair now completely grey, his face marked by new lines that spoke of sleepless nights and internal struggles. "Thank you for coming," he said when she approached. There was no attempt at a kiss or a hug, just a polite gesture indicating the chair in front of her. Helen sat down, remaining alert, studying him. "Why did you want to see me?" "To thank you," he replied, surprising her. "I know it. Sounds absurd after everything, but you did what no one else had the courage to do. You forced me to confront who I really was." Helen frowned, suspicious. "If this is some kind of manipulation—" "No." Thomas shook his head. "Those days are over. I'm trying to live with honesty now, however difficult it may be." He paused, taking a sip of the simple coffee in front of him. "I truly loved you, Helen. Not in the way you deserved, not in a healthy way, but it was the closest I ever came to genuinely caring about someone other than myself." Helen felt something stir within her. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but perhaps understanding. "I never planned to feel anything for you," she admitted. "It was just revenge, just justice." "I know." His smile was sad, resigned. "And it was deserved. Every part." They talked for almost 2 hours, about the past, about the consequences, about the lives that had been affected. Thomas spoke about his current work, volunteering at an NGO that supported small entrepreneurs in vulnerable communities. Helen talked about her new design studio, ironically financed with the money he had given her during their months together. When they finally stood to say goodbye, there was something between them that neither could have predicted. Not reconciliation, not renewed romance, but a mutual understanding that transcended the simple categories of victim and villain. "I can never undo what I did to your father," Thomas said, his voice low, sincere. "But if there's anything I can do for you, anything at all—" Helen considered the offer for a long moment. "There is one thing. Mrs. Eleanor, the woman who spoke at the press conference, always dreamed of reopening her stationery shop. Not out of financial need now, but for meaning. Help her achieve that, not as charity, but as a genuine partnership." Thomas nodded, a spark of something like purpose illuminating his eyes. "It will be done. You have my word." "Does your word mean something now?" Helen asked, not with sarcasm, but with genuine curiosity. "I'm trying to make it mean something," he replied simply. They parted on the sidewalk in front of the cafe, without kisses, without hugs, just a brief handshake that carried the weight of everything they had lived through. Helen watched him walk away on foot, blending into the crowd, an ordinary man now, stripped of the power and privileges that had for so long defined his identity. For a moment, she felt a pang of something indefinable. Not regret, not exactly, perhaps just the understanding that revenge, even when justified, even when successful, is never simple. It's never the final point we imagine. 3 months later, Helen received an invitation to the inauguration of a small stationery shop in Shoreditch, not far from where her father's shop used to be. Memories and Dreams was the name of the establishment, a partnership between Mrs. Eleanor and a silent investor who Helen knew was Thomas. She went to the inauguration, watching from afar as Mrs. Eleanor, radiant in her new beginning, cut the ribbon with hands trembling from age, but eyes shining with happiness. Thomas was there, discreet, not drawing attention to himself, genuinely letting that moment belong to the elderly merchant. Their gazes met briefly across the small gathered crowd. There was no more anger there, no desire, no manipulation, only recognition of who they had been, of who they were trying to become. Helen felt a hand lightly touch her shoulder and turned to find Louisa, Preston beside her. In the months since the press conference, the two women had developed an unlikely friendship, united by shared experience and a determination to transform trauma into purpose. "Do you think he's really changed?" Louisa asked, following her gaze to Thomas. Helen considered the question carefully before answering. "I think he is changing, and perhaps that's the most any of us can do. Try to be better today than we were yesterday." Louisa nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I never imagined I'd be in the same room as him again without feeling hatred." "Neither did I," Helen admitted, "but it seems there are more paths beyond revenge or love." They remained side by side, watching the celebration, two women who had survived the storm and found not exactly peace, but a kind of resolution. An acceptance that some stories don't end in classic happy ever afters, nor in absolute tragedies, but in something more nuanced, more real, the continuous possibility of redemption, the unending journey of understanding what it means to be human, with all the flaws and potentials that implies. Weeks later, Helen was in her new studio, working on designs for a sustainable fashion collection. Ironically, the project Thomas had initially used as a pretext to bring her into his orbit. The studio was small, but bright, full of plants and colorful fabrics, so different from the cold, impersonal environments of the Constantine group. Her phone rang. It was Thomas. They hadn't spoken directly since the stationery shop's inauguration day, although they occasionally exchanged messages about practical matters related to the reparation projects. "Helen," his voice was strangely tense. "I'm at the hospital. Mrs. Eleanor had a stroke." Helen felt her heart tighten. In recent months, she had developed a genuine affection for the elderly woman, visiting her regularly at the stationery shop, listening to stories of the neighborhood, of her father's time. "I'm coming right now," she said, already gathering her purse. "Which hospital?" "The London clinic. I got her the best care." Helen took a taxi and 40 minutes later found herself in the sophisticated lobby of the private hospital. Thomas was waiting for her, his face tense with genuine concern. "How is she?" Helen asked, ignoring the formalities. "Stable. The doctors say it was mild, that there are good chances of a full recovery." He hesitated, running a hand through his graying hair. "But she's asking for you. In fact, she's insisting on speaking with both of us, together." Helen frowned, confused, but followed Thomas through the impeccable corridors to the private room where Mrs. Eleanor rested. The sight of the elderly woman, normally so vibrant and talkative, connected to monitors and IVs, made something contract within her. "Ah, finally!" Mrs. Eleanor's voice was weaker, but her spirit clearly intact. "Come here, both of you." Helen approached the bed from the right side, Thomas from the left. Mrs. Eleanor extended her hands, holding one of each of theirs. "I had a scare," she said with a small smile. "And a scare has a way of clearing the mind. Life is too short to carry certain burdens." Thomas and Helen exchanged confused glances over the bed. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Eleanor?" Helen asked gently. "I'm talking about you two, you stubborn creatures." The elderly woman squeezed both hands she held. "I see how you look at each other. I see what still exists there, even if you yourselves don't want to see it." Helen felt her face flush. "Mrs. Eleanor, you're getting things confused. Thomas and I have a complicated past." "Complicated?" The elderly woman huffed with surprising energy for someone who had just suffered a stroke. "Life is complicated, dear. If we wait for everything to be simple and neat to live, we'll die waiting." Thomas seemed equally uncomfortable. "Mrs. Eleanor, what happened between Helen and me? It was terrible, it was painful, it was unfair." "I know all that," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted him impatiently. "I also know that you two are the most different people I've ever met, compared to who you were 6 months ago." She turned her gaze back to Thomas. "You were a monster of arrogance, and now you are a man trying to do right day after day, without expecting applause or forgiveness." Then she looked at Helen. "And you, dear, were so consumed by hatred you could barely breathe. Now you are learning to live again, to create instead of destroy." Helen lowered her head, feeling the words penetrate places she had tried to keep closed. "I'm not saying you should leave here and get married," Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice now softer. "I'm saying you deserve the chance to discover who you are now to each other, without the weight of the past, without the roles of victim and villain." When they left the hospital hours later, Helen and Thomas walked side by side through the parking lot in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The night was clear, the London sky exceptionally starry for such a brightly lit metropolis. "She's surprising," Thomas finally commented with a small smile. "Always has been," Helen agreed. "Since I met her. She's the kind of person who sees beyond surfaces." They reached his car, no longer a chauffeured limousine, but a simple, discreet model that he now drove himself. "Can I give you a ride?" Thomas offered hesitantly. Helen considered the offer. It would be so easy to refuse to call a taxi to maintain the safe distance they had established in recent months, but something in Mrs. Eleanor's words resonated within her. About burdens, about discovering who they were now. "Yes," she finally replied. "Thank you." The drive to her apartment passed in comfortable silence. When they arrived, Thomas turned off the engine but made no move to get out of the car. Helen also remained seated, as if both were waiting for something, some sign about what should happen next. "She was right, you know," Thomas finally said, looking through the windshield at the London night. "About who we were, about how we've changed." Helen nodded slowly. "Yes, but that doesn't erase the past." "No, it doesn't erase it." Thomas turned to face her, his dark eyes now stripped of the arrogance that once characterized them. "But perhaps it doesn't need to be erased. Perhaps we can build something new, something different." Helen felt her heart quicken. "I don't know if that's possible, Thomas." "Neither do I." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the harsh lines that years of power and control had sculpted. "But I'd like to find out, one day at a time, without rush, without pressure, without expectations." Helen looked at him for a long moment, seeing no longer the Thomas Constantine who had destroyed her father's life, no longer the corporate predator who had used and discarded people like pawns in a game, but the man he was trying to become. Imperfect, still battling his demons, but genuinely changed. "A coffee," she finally said. "We can start with a coffee. Tomorrow." His smile widened, illuminating his eyes in a way she had never seen before. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Helen got out of the car and walked to the building entrance. At the door she turned to see him still watching her, waiting for her to enter safely before leaving. A small gesture of consideration that the old Thomas would never have shown. As she went up to her apartment, Helen reflected on the unpredictability of life, how she had started that journey with a single purpose, revenge, only to discover that the path led to places she had never imagined. Not love, not yet, perhaps never, but possibility, redemption. The chance to discover what kind of story they could write together, not as predator and prey, not as villain and heroine, but as two people deeply marked by life, trying to find something of value in the ashes of what had been destroyed. In her pocket, her phone vibrated with a message. It was from Thomas. "The simplest cafe in the city. No luxuries, no past. Just us, as we are now." Helen smiled, replying simply, "Perfect." And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she had forgotten. Hope. Not a naive hope, not a certainty of happy endings, but that more mature, more resilient hope that comes after the storm. The understanding that even the darkest stories can sometimes find light, that even paths initiated in revenge can, surprisingly, lead to redemption, and perhaps, just perhaps, to true love. True.